This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is about a rule that quietly stopped being a rule. For decades, power in this hemisphere worked on an assumption you were never asked to approve, that force would be restrained, that borders mattered, that allies were not treated as inventory, that dominance did not need to be declared out loud. That assumption is gone, not debated, not repealed, just removed. What replaced it is not chaos. Chaos would be easier. What replaced it is something colder, a system that no longer asks permission, a system that no longer explains itself, a system that measures stability as control and cooperation as weakness. You are not supposed to notice this yet. That's the point. But once you see it, you can't unsee what comes next. If you want to understand why governments are suddenly moving without speeches, without drama, without asking approval, stay with me. Because this story doesn't start with force. It starts with silence. What actually runs this system now is not ideology. It's leverage, not votes, not speeches. Access. Access to shipping lanes, access to energy, access to minerals buried where maps turn vague and treaties turn polite. For a long time, power pretended to be rules-based. Agreements, norms, institutions. But those were never the engine. They were the cover. The engine was always the ability to decide who gets access and who doesn't. That calculation has changed. The system no longer treats neighboring countries as partners. It treats them as terrain, as corridors, as stockpiles, places to move through, extract from, secure, and hold. And once a system starts seeing geography this way, personalities stop mattering, elections stop mattering, promises stop mattering. What matters is whether consent is efficient or optional. This is the quiet shift most people miss. The moment when cooperation becomes conditional and conditions are enforced, not negotiated. And when that happens, everyone nearby has to make the same decision at the same time. Do they adapt or do they get managed? That question is already forcing movement, and that movement is accelerating. There was a time when influence moved quietly. Before, pressure came wrapped in trade deals. Before, disagreements were buried in committees. Before, power advanced slowly enough to feel consensual. That pace mattered. Because slow change feels voluntary. It feels reasonable. It feels like stability. But the system learned something dangerous. Speed exposes intent. Slowness hides it. So the shift didn't arrive as an announcement. It arrived as normalization, as small exceptions, temporary measures, special circumstances, each one defensible, none alarming on its own, until the baseline moved. Now, enforcement comes first. Explanation comes later, if at all. Decisions are made upstream, and downstream countries are expected to adjust quietly, efficiently, without friction. This is not a sudden break. It's worse than that. It's continuity without consent. And the most destabilizing part isn't the action. It's the expectation that resistance is irrational, that compliance is practical, that adaptation is the adult response. Once a system reaches that stage, it doesn't need threats. It relies on anticipation. Everyone starts moving before they're told to move. And when that happens, alliances don't fracture loudly. They realign silently, which is exactly what's happening now. Then the system stopped pretending. In one night, force crossed a line that had held, not perfectly, but consistently for decades. No coalition, no authorization ritual, no slow diplomatic choreography to soften what was coming. Just action. A sovereign boundary treated as procedural. Leadership removed as if jurisdiction were optional. Resources reassigned before the dust settled. This was framed as necessity, as urgency, as security. But look closely. The speed mattered more than the justification, because speed sends a message faster than words ever could. It says, this is no longer hypothetical. It says, precedent has been updated. It says, Capability now outruns restraint. What made this moment different wasn't the target, it was the audience. Every neighboring government understood the signal immediately. If it can happen there, it can happen anywhere. Geography is considered strategic. That's the part you weren't meant to focus on. So if this feels abrupt, good, it's supposed to, because systems don't announce phase changes, they demonstrate them. And once demonstrated, they don't need to repeat themselves. Stay with me, because the reaction to this moment matters more than the moment itself. And the reaction is already underway. Here's how the mechanism actually works. Force isn't the goal, it's the lubricant. The real objective is to remove negotiation from the equation, to make access automatic, to make control feel logistical instead of political. Once that happens, winners are determined quietly. Corporations with preferred contracts, supply chains that no longer need consent, governments that can guarantee delivery without asking voters or neighbors. And the cost? The cost is absorbed diffusely by partners who lose leverage but keep responsibility, by regions told that security requires sacrifice without being asked what they're sacrificing, by publics who feel pressure without seeing the hand applying it. This is the genius of the system. Damage is distributed, benefit is concentrated. No one announces the transfer. It happens through coordination, through alignment, through technical language that sounds neutral while rearranging power underneath it. And if a country resists, resistance is reclassified as risk, as instability, as something to be managed. That's when the pressure escalates, not necessarily with troops, but with exclusion from markets, from financing, from intelligence, from protection. At that point, sovereignty becomes theoretical. So countries start calculating not morality, not loyalty, survival. And when survival becomes the metric, alliances stop being emotional. They become architectural, which explains the next move. Then the tempo changed. Suddenly, decisions that used to take years happened in weeks. Meetings without press, statements without names, trips that weren't announced until they were over, budgets moved, procurement shifted, old assumptions quietly expired. This wasn't panic. Panic is loud. This was preparation. You could see it in where money stopped flowing, in which suppliers were replaced, in which partnerships were labeled under review. You could see it in geography, in maps that suddenly mattered again, in cold places. In routes once considered theoretical, exercises got longer. Presence became permanent. Infrastructure stopped being dual use in theory and started being built that way in reality. And notice what didn't happen. No speeches about betrayal, no dramatic exits, no declarations of independence, because that would invite response. This phase is about deniability, about building options quietly before options are taken away. Everyone involved understands the clock is running, not toward peace, toward positioning, because once access is enforced instead of negotiated, delay becomes vulnerability. And the countries that move last don't get to choose. They get assigned, which is why the next part isn't about governments. It's about you. This is where it reaches you, not as a headline, as a constraint. You feel it when prices shift without explanation, when supply becomes unpredictable, when projects stall because components are delayed or suddenly sourced somewhere else at a higher cost under new conditions. You're told this is normal, that it's global, that it's temporary. But notice the pattern. Risk is being downloaded from systems to households, from states to individuals. You're expected to absorb volatility so institutions can preserve flexibility. Security is invoked. Stability is promised. And responsibility quietly moves in your direction. You didn't vote on this. You weren't briefed. You weren't asked how much uncertainty you could carry. But your life is now part of the buffer. That's what strategic realignment looks like from the inside. Less predictability, fewer guarantees, more exposure. And if this feels abstract, it won't for long. Because once governments accept that protection is conditional, They plan accordingly. They harden. They hedge. They prepare for pressure, which means the next effects don't stay domestic. They ripple. If you want to understand why this isn't just happening somewhere else, keep watching. Because the system doesn't stop at borders. Once this shift begins, it doesn't respect distance. What starts as a regional assertion becomes a template. Other powers notice, not the rhetoric, the efficiency. They watch how quickly rules are bypassed, how little cost is paid, how fast allies adjust instead of resisting. That lesson travels. Suddenly, trade routes are no longer neutral. They're leverage points. Infrastructure projects aren't economic, they're strategic. Even aid becomes conditional, calibrated to alignment rather than need. Countries that once relied on guarantees start writing contingency plans, quietly, simultaneously. Not because they want confrontation, but because the system has taught them what happens without options. This is how fragmentation spreads. Not through explosions, but through duplication. Parallel supply chains, parallel security arrangements, parallel rules. The world doesn't split cleanly. It overlaps, competes, crowds itself. And the danger isn't that one power dominates everything. The danger is that no one trusts the floor anymore. When that happens, coordination becomes harder precisely when stakes are higher. Every move is hedged, every promise discounted. And in that environment, speed favors those willing to act first. Which brings us to what happens next. Because systems under pressure don't stabilize, they accelerate. From here, the system has three possible directions. The first is adjustment. In this path, countries recalibrate quietly. New understandings replace old ones. Access is negotiated differently. Power is acknowledged rather than denied. The system becomes more transactional, less idealistic, but stable enough to function. Nothing breaks. Nothing heals. It just adapts. The second is erosion. Here, trust decays faster than structures can compensate. Agreements still exist, but they're hedged. Cooperation becomes conditional on leverage. Security guarantees are interpreted narrowly. Everyone stays nominally aligned while behaving defensively. The system holds, but thinner, louder, more brittle. Then there's rupture. This is the path no one announces and everyone plans for, where a test goes too far, where enforcement meets resistance, where parallel systems collide instead of coexisting. Not total collapse, but visible fracture. Inside alliances, inside regions, inside assumptions that once felt permanent. None of these paths are chosen by speeches. They're chosen by sequencing, by who moves first, by who absorbs cost and who refuses to. And here's the unresolved part. Different countries are already on different paths at the same time. Adjustment here, erosion there, preparations for rupture everywhere else, which means the future isn't a fork, it's a spread. And the direction you end up in may not be the one you intended to choose. There's a temptation at the end of stories like this to look for reassurance, to believe systems correct themselves. That pressure produces balance. That history bends back towards stability. But systems don't correct. They compound. What you're watching isn't a crisis. It's a repricing of power, of consent, of who gets to say no and when that no still counts. The most dangerous moment isn't when force is used. It's when others reorganize around the expectation that it might be. That's where we are now. Quiet construction, silent hedging, alternatives built not for today, but for the day. Permission stops working. Nothing here is finished. Nothing is settled. The map is being redrawn while everyone pretends it's still the same one. And if this feels unfinished, that's because it is. The next phase doesn't arrive with an announcement. It arrives with a test. Somewhere you're told doesn't matter. In a place that's strategic, over something framed as access. So don't look away now, because the next story isn't about what power claims. It's about who decides to stop asking. If you want to follow where this leads, stay with me.